conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I know this is my first show that I've done in a few weeks, and partially because, well, about a week or so. I believe I did a show about a week ago. And partially due to, of course, the weather that we've had has prevented me from kind of getting out necessarily to the studio like I normally like to in order to record the video format. But also over the last week or two, I've been dealing with a sore throat. And my voice has been affected, harder to speak. In fact, even today, you can probably hear I'm an octave or two lower as I'm still dealing with a sore throat. And between segments, I will be chugging water. But I did want to bring you updates because, oh boy, the session has started, Kentucky's legislative session. That means you need to be paying even more attention to the Andrew Cooperrider Show because we'll be bringing you updates from this legislative session and going through it with how much is going on and my desire to keep you informed. I'll be sure to make sure episodes are coming out more than just once a week like they have been over the past few weeks and holidays because we need to stay on top of what the legislature is doing. In fact, before now, I couldn't even talk to you about any bills that have been being discussed within the legislature formally. I couldn't tell you what they say. I couldn't tell you whether they were fully good or bad. I couldn't tell you anything about it. And that's because about 2 or 3 years ago or so, the legislature made a pretty drastic change to how they handled bills. They would no longer allow legislators to pre-file bills before the session. Basically, the public would be unaware of what bills were being considered. And they said they did this because they didn't want the news media and citizens and everything else getting riled up or excited about pieces of legislation that were never going to move forward. It would control the conversation too much leading up into session. It just put out fake news, and this was done for the people. But the real reason why this was done was for the lobbyists. You see, the way it works for us citizens, trying to get a bill moving, trying to get support behind a bill can sometimes take time if you don't have a lot of money. If you think about how you pass a piece of legislation, you have, I guess, a triangle with 3 different sides, and you have to have at least 2 of the 3. And one is time, technique, and, of course, resources and money. Now, if you don't have a lot of time, but you have good technique and money, you can certainly put up a pretty quick fight and get things done as long as you know how to do it. If you don't have a lot of technique, you're not very good at your job, but if you have enough time and money, you can get legislation passed. But if you don't have money, you need both time and technique. It's hard to find individuals who can actually fight on grassroots issues that are willing to put forward the time and have the technique to it. And I'll give you a perfect example. I was talking to a friend of mine about an issue they're deeply concerned about. He was asking me about restoration of voting rights for convicted felons. Regardless of how you feel about the issue, when he was asking me, how do we get this piece of legislation passed? I said, well, your first problem is you have no incentive for the legislators themselves to want to pass the legislation. You see, when it comes to restoring voting rights for felons, for Republican legislators, I'm sure, I'm not going to pretend like there's a large amount of voters who care about that issue on either side per se, where it's a single issue, for lack of a better term, for them. And what I mean is that, things like abortion, gun rights, things like maybe if you're on the Democrat side, health care being paid for by the government or LGBTQ rights or so on and so forth. Those may be single issues. You don't care how a representative actually feels or thinks about literally anything else beyond those issues. If they are okay with those issues, now you consider the lower issues and you might be comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, as far as within primary. So if you're within a Republican primary, you're comparing one Republican to another. Once you know both of them are for gun rights, both of them don't want to stop abortion. Well, then you start getting down into the other issues that once you check mark this box and this box, I'll consider you on these ones. That's why a lot of times you'll see, especially in Republican primaries, fights coming down to who's most pro-life and who's most pro-gun. You'll always see, of course, that quintessential photo of somebody holding a gun that probably really doesn't even know how to hold it correctly because they only do it for this photo shoot. And it's done to show I'm more pro-gun than the other guy, so that way I super check mark that box for you to make sure you know that it's done. In fact, in political circles, generally speaking, when we're talking about sending out mailers and talking points and those kinds of issues, when we're knocking on doors, we say you should give them 3 talking points. And the first 2, if you're a Republican, are already decided. You're pro-life and you're pro-gun. You maybe get to make a decision on the other one. And for those of you who think, well, shouldn't every Republican be pro-life and pro-gun? Let me tell you from running for office firsthand that is the number 1 and 2 questions interchangeably you will get when you knock doors. And so if you don't tell them right away, if you're not constantly telling voters that, well, they will assume differently. And so I bring all that up to say that he was talking to me about restoration of voting rights. And I said, well, look, you've got time, you've got technique. You've put in a lot of time or technique, and maybe you don't have a lot of money, maybe you do. But the technique here is you have to convince the voters that during a primary that they wouldn't shellac their Republican representative for voting for it, because many of these Republicans are simply worried about what's going on in the primary. And if the mind of the voters, and I'm not telling you how you should think about this issue, that's not really important, but was the advice to this individual who's asking me about it, was that, look, if you can't make a good argument to the voters that would otherwise find this issue objectionable of why they should be in support of this, well, there's no incentive for the legislator themselves to vote yes for it. They don't feel strongly either way, maybe, but they're doing the calculation saying this is too much of a political liability for me. And that's what, in large part, the lobbyists, of course, are also playing on. But when there was legislation being proposed and we knew about it months in advance, like it used to be, well, we could get together rallies when the weather's better, of course, too, as well, because it's not as good right now. I mean, it's only a 30-day session. We'll have 2 months of pretty horrible weather. It's hard to gather together people to fight on a cause. You're able to get in more calls, more emails, build your lists on them, be able to continue to, for lack of a better term, harass through their constituents, the legislators, to get a piece of legislation either moving or to kill a piece of legislation if you don't like it. But by limiting like this, it takes away that leg of time and can largely affect and cut out from underneath the activists that want to stop pieces of legislation or start them from being able to do so. Because now they only have technique. They don't have time and they don't have money. Because the lobbyists, though, will have money and they have plenty of time. They know exactly what pieces of legislation are going on. They're literally paid to be in Frankfurt 5 days a week, talking to the legislators, getting their feel, figuring out what's moving through and what's not. Meanwhile, we citizens like myself and you, we work jobs, we have other things that we're doing. We can't be in Frankfurt with our fingers on the pulse 24/7. I rely on, the same way you do, websites like LRC, Legislative Research Commission, to post the bills so I know what's being considered and what's not. But when we come back, I'm going to start digging into some of these pieces of legislation. And I think it's incredibly important as we look through it, because this is when, we move away from where Bashir's kind of been setting policy, and now we give legislators a chance to respond to what he's been doing. So we'll go through some of the bills that have been proposed. No particular reason why these ones, other than just chronological order. We'll be working through bills probably all this week. So make sure you stay tuned. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back here with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So going through some bills, we're going to start off with I'm going to call them bills of discussion. They're generally good bills I support. Not anything, sometimes they're bills I support, but I don't think they're particularly important, where I'm going to spend hours and hours talking about the issue and why it's incredibly important and encouraging you to get out there and to put together rallies for it. But They are bills that are worthy of discussion as we look through the initial set of them coming through. As I said, later on this week, we'll talk about more, but let's dig into it. So first bill, and this bill has, I believe, already passed the House, is House Bill 1, which is a tax cut of 0.5% to the income tax. Now, this comes despite the falling revenues that are being reported out of the Beshear administration. Now, in large part, what this has to do with is an overall plan. So there's a reason why this cut is coming, even though revenues are projected to fall. And it deals with your fiscal years, right? So fiscal year X runs from July 1st through to June 30th. I believe I'm correct. July 1st through June 30th. That's the fiscal year within the state. So when they're talking about, okay, we're projected to lose revenues come this fiscal year, they're talking about up here in June. They'll post it. Now, the way the income tax reduction plan was originally set up was that they would do it based upon hitting certain markers through the previous fiscal year. So while this fiscal year maybe is indicating we're not going to get a tax cut next year based upon their plan, if they choose to continue to follow it, what it is showing is that according to the prior fiscal year before this one, the one they're responding to with this tax cut, we did hit the markers. And basically the markers are that they can reduce this tax without, based upon that year, the reduction in tax, we made more than that in additional revenue. We hit a certain revenue marker. We spend a certain amount where even if we reduce it, we can still afford to spend that same amount and revenue continues to grow. Now, I've been a long time, against this plan because it requires larger government spending to get a cut on income tax. I'll always be for actual tax cuts, things that lower the revenues going into the state. The state is making more money. Whatever you're doing is not cutting taxes. It's a simple idea. It's crazy how many legislators don't get it. They'll talk about that, or maybe they're choosing to be ignorant, pretend they don't understand. But, the state can't make more money and cut taxes. It's not how it works, right? Either you're growing people, and we're not growing people that much, or you somehow, some way are getting more in revenues and fees through other sources that are creating a burden on the lives of your citizens. But in this case, they're taking away from income tax and they're finding the money elsewhere. And so, in large part, this tax still gets to go through. Many of the Democrats voted for it. Only 7 voted against it in the House. It'll be interesting to see what Beshear does on this bill as well. If you remember, he vetoed the original plan, which called for replacing the income tax with a sales tax. And he vetoed it because he said that this is a regressive tax. Basically, the thought process is that an income tax hits the wealthiest and a sales tax somehow hits the poorest amongst us. Now, of course, we're ignoring the fact that your essentials like food and water are in large part not taxed. Medicine is not taxed. Things you need to live are not taxed. I believe, of course, your dwellings, generally speaking, your shelter is not taxed. Your utilities are not taxed as long as it's on one home here in Kentucky. Now, if you own multiple homes, you do get that tax, which, is a weird, that's a recent thing they put in with that plan a few years ago to do this gradual stair step down. They expanded out the sales tax categories. And one of those categories included charging utilities tax, a power tax, if you owned more than one dwelling that was in your name residentially, which, for landlords that do all utilities included rents for people, that obviously cause the rents to increase. So that does raise, of course, that for everybody. But regardless, the point is that in large part, of course, the necessities aren't taxed by the sales tax. So what you do get taxed on would be what they call things you don't necessarily need to survive. Now, you may disagree with those categories, agree with them. That doesn't as much matter to this discussion as much as the claim that this is regressive because, of course, they say it taxes poor people more, while meanwhile, the income tax only helps out rich. Now, of course, an income tax cut is going to help largely people who make incomes. And of course, the more income you make, the more a 0.5% tax benefits you, true. But at the same time, a person who makes more money is buying more things. They're also paying more of the sales tax than somebody who makes less money. So I think it kind of evens out. But it will be interesting to see what Beshear does, because while he's attacked this tax initially during his governor's election, he had no problem taking credit for the work done by this taxation plan. So it is interesting, of course, to see. Another bill that we're seeing is House Bill 16. That deals with making water fluoridation, I guess that'd be the proper term, right? Putting fluoride in the water. It allows the local water districts to go ahead and have the option of whether or not to add it. Right now, they are forced to by state statute, and this would allow them to vote and decide. Of course, fluoride in the water has become a more hot issue, I guess you could say, especially with RFK talking about it at the national level and the Trump administration talking about it as well. So for Republicans, this is becoming more of a national conversation. And of course, Kentucky Republicans are the first to fall right in. If they see something's a winner nationally, they will jump right on it. They're never going to be the first ones to the punch. And we know this because this particular bill has been proposed many a times to make this optional for years and years and years. It's been trying to get passed. Those of you longtime listeners to the show know that last year I had on Cindy Batson, who talked about, of course, this piece of legislation and really dug into it, dealt with some of the issues surrounding it. And when this bill came across, the media, a large part, were making fun of Republicans, saying you just want teeth to fall out, everything else. And then lo and behold, exactly what Cindy was saying while she was on the show and others turns out to be true and more popular now that people are realizing that water fluoride may in fact lower the IQs of the children who drink it. So look-a-dee what happens, right? And so it's just interesting to see this. Does it move forward more so? I think so. I think in large part, of course, they see, well, this is going on elsewhere. This is a part of the Republican brand. It would only hurt us. It would look like we're going against, of course, Trump. And that is one thing I can say. I mean, we talk about this often on the show, but what these politicians really care about is getting elected, staying elected, and getting elected to higher office. So getting elected, reelected, in higher office. And when they see somebody doing well in higher office that's running on these issues, they'll reach on to him very quickly because they're trying to ride those coattails themselves into higher office. They want to get on that Trump train. And so in this case, they're going to be looking at the water fluoridation, and that bill has some good legs to pass. But the other thing that they're doing that also falls right in line with that Trump train is putting no income tax on tips and overtime. Now, I'm going to put this in a category of, I'm for this, of course. Any way that we can stop the government from having more money, I'm for it. However, I do take some issue, and those of you who listen to Matt Walsh at all, when this was being floated, of course, during the campaigns for president, he talked about no tax on tips in a way, and I think it made a lot of sense. No tax on overtime. That makes a lot of sense in the way of you're working overtime. We're only going to tax you on 40 hours a week, not if you work 60 hours a week. Though I do have a question for those of you who say no tax on overtime. And it's the same thing with no tax on tips. This really deals with the philosophy standpoint for Republicans. Why is it that we don't want, I just don't want the government to have more money, period. So no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Whatever takes money out of their coffers forces them to do less. They have less money to leverage in order to get involved in my life. I'm cool with it regardless. I'm not going to look at my own cup and say, I'm getting taxed this amount. Why isn't this guy paying the same as I am in taxes? He should have to pay more. I can be upset that I'm paying so much without demanding other people have to pay as much as me as well. But it is like a philosophical standpoint. What is it about tips, which we know waitresses and waiters and people who largely exist off tips, That is their income. The same way that my income is my income, your income is your income. That is what they get paid. Why is it that their particular income, for some reason, deserves to not be subjected to income tax? And then on top of that too, when we come to overtime. So if I work 40 hours a week at one job and then I work 20 hours a week at another job, I'm working the same amount of hours a week as a person who works 60 hours a week at one employer. But yet you're saying the 20 hours that that person works at that one employer for some reason shouldn't be taxed at all to income tax. But the 60 hours a week that I'm working, but because I'm doing it two employers, I deserve to be taxed on those 20 other hours a week beyond 40 that I am working. It leaves a question of the philosophy behind it. If you're saying, look, this is a stair step to get us to 0% income tax, period, I'm with you 100%. But just cutting out and saying, you know what, these people suddenly don't have to pay taxes and these people suddenly don't have to pay taxes while everybody else does, lacks a kind of philosophical, a political philosophical reasoning that remains consistent. It makes no sense to me why you're holding these incomes as different. We should just not tax anybody's income. It's wrong and it's immoral and it's theft. But we'll be coming up after this. We'll talk about some more pieces of legislation. We'll have that after this short break. And you are back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, digging through some bills. Of course, we've talked so far about water fluoridation, cutting taxes on tips and overtime, cutting income tax in general. Now we got some other bills here that I wanted to discuss before we get into some bad or conversational bills, whatever you want to call them. Bills I just have a more negative opinion of. Not negative, but I have something negative to say about them, I guess you'd call it. But here's some more, though, that I think are good-ish. Maybe not good-ish, but, are bills that I don't think it ends the world either way if they pass or fail per se, but should probably pass. Water fluoridation, I think, is pretty important. Should probably pass. Tax cuts, HB1 tax cut, that will pass, and it should. No tax on tips and overtime. I don't get paid through tips or overtime, so personally it doesn't affect me. Now, like I said, I do want to see government make less money because that means they can do less in my life, so I'm for it for that reason, but does lack a kind of philosophical consistency as far as why this gets taxed and this income doesn't. But moving on from that here, we've got an interesting bill from John Hodgson, who's, if anything, he's always been on top of these worrying about surveillance, protecting your privacy. He's got a few bills this session on it. He's got one bill to make it to where you can't be tracked without your consent unless it's for law enforcement or it's a parent on a minor. So, slipping a tracking device onto your own car by a jealous girlfriend or boyfriend or something like that would not be allowed, which is, of course, interesting. But ALRPs are automatic license, or ALPR, are automatic license plate readers, and they've become pretty popular with police departments, especially as they say they've had a hard time with staffing, because what it does is it automatically scans license plates as they're driving by a camera, and then will alert police if there's a license plate that pops up that belongs to a stolen vehicle, a vehicle of interest due to an abduction, a vehicle of interest due to an escaped convict, maybe just basically vehicles of interest to the police, and alert them in the area. And then they can, of course, proceed to go ahead and pull those vehicles over and search them. Now, in large part, this has been a pushback from people like myself because, quite frankly, it leaves a lot of, I'm sure it helps somewhat, in quotations, with a variety of different things, but it provides a database of being able to be tracked whether you like it or not. We've seen, of course, the police and things asking to be plugged into Ring doorbells, to be able to use them for surveillance. And the general question becomes, how much do you want to be watched? How much do you want to be tracked? The easier it is for the government to track all of your movements, the easier it is for them to go ahead and put surveillance on you. When it takes a person, and this goes into limitation of resources, when it takes a physical person to follow you around, it means that the government isn't going to be bothered with surveilling somebody that they just kind of don't like their political speech. But, if they can catch them in the act of something and take them out of circulation, then it would make their lives better. They'd be able to get away from being held as accountable. Whether that's local police, we've seen local police corruption in many of these towns here in Kentucky. We've seen an interesting story in eastern Kentucky regarding that, regarding a man that was arrested inside the police station, and then magically the footage disappears and the body cam footage disappears or is non-existent, and then they delete the video he was recording on his phone, off the phone, tampering with evidence, right? They're able to recover the video. That's how they've been able to prove this. But some pretty crazy things have happened recently in Kentucky. We have Somerset, or London, where a police officers raided the wrong house, apparently over a weed eater, and ended up killing a person. So we're seeing local police departments surveilling and seeming to have some corruption problems going on here. That's always been an issue, of course, especially in eastern Kentucky. But we see it more and more. And providing these tools of being able to surveil these citizens gives you the ability to lash out at individuals who just wrong the wrong person. In fact, we've seen automatic license plate readers being used by police officers in order to track the movements of their ex-wives or girlfriends or people they're going through divorces through, and misusing that data. And so Hodgson has put forward this bill to make it to where you can't store that data for very length of time, 60 days. So it can't be stored indefinitely. And he's also put forward a piece of, within that legislation, he's also included that insurance companies should have access to it if an accident occurs. And that's interesting because it helps them assign blame. Of course, with Kentucky being a no-fault state, if both people are like, nah, he did it, and the police can't figure out who's telling the truth or not, and many times they're not going to investigate it. They don't care. They just write up a report. But the insurance companies, and you care whose fault it is because you don't want your rates to go up, and the insurance companies care about it. So allowing them to access that video footage makes some sense. There's cameras now, but they're traffic cameras, and they don't generally store the footage on traffic cameras. They're just for you to be able to view what's going on. They're not to catch red lights or people skipping that, but automatic license plate readers are used to record things and store that information. And so putting some more restrictions on that is great. Now, they should be probably gotten rid of entirely unless we can guarantee that they won't be misused, but there's no way to do that. It's impossible. So the next best thing is to go ahead and limit how long data can be stored and also be able to hold people accountable when they do misuse that data. Here's another interesting piece of legislation that I thought has been needed for some time. I'm glad to see it kind of coming together. House Bill 41, the Emergency Volunteer Corps. So you would like for government to not necessarily do this per se. You'd like for private industry to somewhat kind of handle as much as they can. However, it's become a bit of a problem that has been noticeable. Anybody who's shown up to floods or these tornadoes or other disasters that have occurred here in Kentucky, you show up as a volunteer and you want to help, or maybe you're online and you're looking for ways to help. And what Beshear has done is set up slush funds where you can just donate money to the slush fund that then he has control over. And in large part, this last tornado relief fund, they ended up sending out $1,000 checks to people who weren't even damaged by the tornadoes. And so what this Emergency Volunteer Corps seeks to do is to create local volunteers, so it shouldn't cost a whole lot of money. Of course, administrating it may cost a little bit extra. But volunteer groups whose job it is to respond to disasters in Kentucky, and basically volunteer coordinators. So if you are somebody who says, hey, I want to show up, I want to help shovel out, I want to help people in floods or tornadoes or help with disaster relief there or digging people out or providing food or water or shelter or those kinds of things. Instead of this patchwork of private nonprofits that in large part do a pretty good job but are competing, and then government people trying to whatever. Instead, let's just put together these groups that know how to respond to this. So every time there's a disaster, it doesn't take a week or two for us to get our legs up underneath of us, for the private volunteers to be able to go ahead and, of course, volunteer. Now, of course, government could take this in large part the wrong way and spend way too much money, but with proper parameters and if proper coordination between things like the National Guard and private volunteers, it could be a pretty useful thing. And I can see the need of it, having been in some of these disaster zones trying to help out and seeing just a complete lack of organization when it's mostly needed right away. You know, when you have people stranded, you have people stuck under rubble and things, and then you have citizens that say, hey, I can come there with diggers and help get people out. Or you have citizens saying, hey, I've got lifted trucks, or I've got boats, or I've got these jet boats that don't need a whole lot of depth in order to go forward. You know, we can come and help get people out. We've got private people who own helicopters that can help people. But how do we put them in contact with the right people? How do we get clearance for them through government that can help kind of do that so we're not chasing each other's tails? So coming up after this, we'll talk about some piece of legislation that I think I have something, I guess you'd call it, negative to say. Not necessarily whether I want the bill to pass or not, just something we're talking about. We'll have that after this short break. And you are back here in this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Sorry, those of you just listening to the audio. I just took a drink of water real quick. It was still sitting on my desk here, as I told you all. You probably hear it dealing with this throat thing. I've been chugging water between the segments, left a bottle up here. But digging into it now, I said I had a piece of legislation that I think we should really dig into that deserves more discussion. And it's a House Bill 33 that was put forward by Thomas Huff. Now, Thomas Huff, those of you who've listened to the show for any length of time know that generally speaking, when it comes to the gambling bills, right? You know, I've mixed feelings about whether we should or shouldn't be kind of how much should we be pushing that for? Should it be legal to do? Should it not? Generally speaking, I think gambling should be legal for people to do, which in a way it is, right? It's still legal for you to sit around and have a friendly card game or something like that. But what is illegal and is monitored as making a profit of people gambling. Of course, you can only do that if you're one of the few select businesses that our legislature has deemed fit to bestow the unique monopoly of being able to make a profit off people gambling here in the state. And, you know, my general feelings have historically been, well, either everybody can do it or nobody can do it. For us to really have a discussion. And we're never going to get rid of horse racing in Kentucky and betting on horses in Kentucky. So there's not particularly a good reason why everybody shouldn't be allowed to do it. But my thought process is that if we aren't going to ban it across the board, and if we do, then that's a different conversation. But if we did ban it across the board and you can run horses around a track, please, without bringing up something to do with government monopolies or something stupid, explain to me the actual difference morally, the difference legally, what shouldn't be a difference between me, a small business owner, saying I'm going to open up a dog racing track. Maybe we have horses, they have dogs that race, or a chicken racing track. I'm going to open up a chicken racing track where chickens can run around in a circle and the first one to pass the line wins. And then I can set that up and make money off of people gambling on these chicken races, or hamsters, guinea pigs running around the track, right? Rats, whatever. If you don't like something not cute, maybe if you think that's cruel, rats running around the track and you can bet on which rat's going to cross the finish line first. There's no real difference. Now they'll say that there's culture and historical value to horse racing. And that's an argument I guess I could hear, but it generally falls apart when we look at what our legislature has been doing recently. And so the issues I take with what they've been doing recently on gambling legislation is they've been handing off monopolies to these horse tracks outside of horse racing even. So it's one thing to say, look, only these 6-7 companies get to have horses run around a track and nobody else can have animals run around a track and gamble. I would argue with you that that's a government enforced monopoly. It's morally wrong. It's tyrannical of the government to do so. It's actually what they would call fascist. Mussolini famously said that fascism should be called corporatism because it's really just getting private business, the marrying of private businesses and government. So I could say all those things about it, but you can make the argument that, well, this is a historical thing. We're just not letting new people do it because it's bad for society. But historically, it's been here, and Kentucky's economy is real important on it. Okay, I hear that argument, and I guess that argument would follow through if you went ahead and banned gray machines, but our legislature went farther and allowed these horse tracks back in 2021 to go ahead and have these slot machines that you see now. And then back in 2020, 4 or 3 or what have you, they allowed them now to engage in sports betting, which is nothing to do with horse racing. And now in Kentucky, if you want to do sports betting like FanDuel does or anything else, it has to be run through one of these 6-7 horse track companies. And so now it's being taken a step further with this bill being proposed by Huff, House Bill 33. Now, what I will say about Huff is you may dog him for bringing this bill forward because you don't like gambling, and that's fair to do. But I wouldn't dog him for necessarily being per se inconsistent. As I said, I believe not monopolies. But if somebody says, look, it's people's money, they should be allowed to spend it how they want to. I think it's a liberty issue. An argument that I can hear and I understand the basis of. Well, I think that Huff has at least been consistent because he did not vote to ban gray machines. Those of you may remember gray machines from 2023 were banned. And that was banned because they weren't running through the horse tracks. That's why people can claim it was about hurting their communities or whatever. But then they turn around and they legalize betting on your phone on sports. So the idea that it was too easy to access doesn't make any sense when it comes to quote unquote gambling. But the real problem with gray machines is the horse tracks, it wasn't being run through and it was sucking business off track. And so therefore, gray machines had to be gotten rid of. Now, Thomas Huff, though, did not vote to ban gray machines. If he had, I'd be calling him out as being incredibly inconsistent. Because what this bill he's proposed does, House Bill 33, would allow local counties to vote to allow a casino to be in their county on a referendum vote. So it's not like the magistrates vote, but the citizens would be able to vote through a referendum to allow a casino in their county. And then the Kentucky Horse Racing and Gaming Corporation could then go ahead and award those licenses in that area. But the bill, as I understand it, does still require that these casinos be ran through the horse track. So the same 6-7 companies, like Churchill Downs, for an example, continue to have a monopoly on gambling in Kentucky. And now they get to expand out as a county allows it into full-fledged casino games. They don't even have to have, because right now, in order to have HHR, historical horse racing, you have to have a horse track within a certain distance from that historical horse racing area, which is they're just slot machines. Well, this would allow full casino games like card games and as such to go on, and would allow, of course, those slot machines and other things to be away from those horse tracks. Like I said, it does require a referendum by the county votes. Now, what's funny about this is that clearly the horse racing people want this to happen, but they actually attacked Thomas Jefferson, who's running in the 45th House District during the primary. The horse tracks attacked him because he was against their monopoly. He wanted anybody to be able to gamble. He didn't want the horse racing to only be the only ones who have monopoly on gambling. And they attacked him by running mailers saying he wanted to bring a casino to Nicholasville, which is hilarious that they attack him over that like a year ago, while simultaneously lobbying and pushing for a bill that would allow them to bring a casino to Nicholasville. And I just find it incredibly ironic for that to be the turn of case. Now, when challenged on these issues, and I've had conversations with legislators and say, look, you are incredibly inconsistent when it comes to gambling. It doesn't make sense that you would ban gray machines. There's no sense in it, unless, of course, you're only doing it at the behest of the horse tracks. And they'll say, we are doing it at the behest of the horse tracks many a times. They'll try to disagree with me, but I know too much about their voting history that they'll end up saying every time that, well, we're doing it to protect the horse industry. Well, first off, the horse farms are not protected by Churchill Downs getting a casino. Churchill Downs is protected, however, and I don't think Churchill Downs needs much protection. In 2023, for an example, they had a revenue of $2.46 billion. That is a 36% increase from 2022. It doesn't really seem like they're struggling anymore. I mean, you took a company that was already making well over $1 billion and you gave them a 36% increase. And then you wonder why they have so much money to lobby for these pushes. I mean, they spent $500,000 during this last primary session because they want to get these kinds of things done, but they're seeing the Liberty folks as a line against it, not because they necessarily have a problem with the gambling, but because they have a problem with the monopoly. And that's not how the horse tracks want to see it. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Many more bills to cover. So make sure you tune back into the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll keep going through them. You have a great rest of your day.